So I want to welcome everyone here to the George Psathas Memorial Keynote Lecture. I do want to announce before we begin, SPEP sent a sort of an email acknowledging or recognizing the passing of the philosopher Charles Mills, who's an important sort of philosopher in terms of author of the Racial Contract and important work in terms of race and philosophy, and I want to sort of acknowledge his passing. I think there's a link to a memorial service for, I think, tomorrow evening that SPEP sent out. Also, this is sort of an important point to remember, SPHS prides ourselves also on diversity and being a very international sort of group and interdisciplinary as well. So we tend to alternate in terms of different disciplines giving some of our keynotes. And we have done all we can to sort of bring together such an international sort of crowds. That's why we have the time zones, the time slots we have here, so we can get the maximum number of people. So when SPHS was founded, we had Alfred Schutz Memorial Lectures, and the first woman to give a Schutz lecture was actually our current speaker today, Rosemary Rizo, Patron de Lerner, in 2005 in Salt Lake City. Now that our lecture series is named after one of our founders, George Psathas, I'm glad that we can have her back. Let me introduce her. Dr. Rosemary Rizo Patron de Lerner is an internationally renowned philosopher and scholar, well respected in the phenomenological and Husserlian communities. Dr. Rosemary Rizo Patron de Lerner is an author of several books, including Husserl, first apologize for my Spanish pronunciation, Husserl and Diálogo, Lecturas y Debates in 2012, El exilio del sujeto, mitos modernos y postmodernos in 2014, and La agonía de la razón, reflexiones desde la filosofía práctica in 2015. She's an author of dozens of articles and book chapters, including very recently an article on Latin America in the Routledge Handbook of Phenomenology and Phenomenological Philosophy, a 2020 article, Evidence and Truth in the Digital Age, a Husserlian Perspective, and the Ideal of Humanity versus World Powers, Kant, Fichte, and Husserl. She's the editor of multiple books and serves on several advisory committees for different series. And finally, she's the finishing as director of the Centro de Estudios Filosóficos in the Departamento de Filosofía in her university there, Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. I want to welcome and thank Dr. Rosemary Rizo Patron de Lerner for her giving us this talk today. And the title of her talk will be Gender Violence Between Instincts and Reason from a Historical Phenomenological Perspective. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much. I want to thank, in the first place, the Society for Phenomenology and Human Sciences for this honor, for inviting me to this George Psathas Memorial Lecture. I am going to share with you a text that I have just written for you to follow. Okay, so my text, 1 minute. So my text is entitled Gender Violence Between Instincts and Reason from a Historical Phenomenological Perspective. Gender violence not only refers to physical, psychological, or sexual aggressions. It also includes forced prostitution, honor crimes, genital mutilation, or sexual trafficking and exploitation. Nowadays, the United Nations and the World Health Organization acknowledge gender violence as a pandemic, and it is dealt with from different perspectives such as law, politics, psychiatry, sociology, philosophy. Unfortunately, it also feeds the tabloids. It is now widely recognized that it is possible to track certain common elements of this scourge throughout human history and across the wide diversity of cultures. Triggered by social media, there is currently a natural tendency towards unilateral diagnoses and reactive mobilizations whose consequences do not always bring about the expected results. In my opinion, if further research is not undertaken into the underlying causes and outreach of this problem in its depth and gravity, more effective and long-lasting solutions will still remain elusive. Since the 20th century, international legislation has begun to address this problem and to elaborate relevant standing legal instruments in the context of international armed conflicts and civil wars. However, visibly slower has been the transfer of these advances to the civil codes of every country worldwide, as well as their implementation by their respective law enforcement bodies. Much more difficult and even more relevant has been the assimilation of these rights by the collective awareness of the peoples. Tabloids and social media do not always help, for they tend to criminalize victims, undervalue or isolate cases, justify them, or report them in sexist terms. Nevertheless, the guidelines on media reporting on violence against women, edited by the United Nations Development Program, are available since 2019. The extreme polarization that surrounds this topic among certain social collectives and networks is also counterproductive. For unless a consciousness of absolutely all citizens, men, women, members of the LGBTIQ plus community, etc., is emotionally touched and concerned, no law nor gender mobilization will achieve the desired purpose. Prudence and sober critical judgment based on deep empathic perception, sympathy, and compassion are needed today more than ever. In this paper, I address the subject of violence in 4 stages. First, and from a cursory interpretation of violence in Western history, especially since modern times, I refer to it as emanating from instincts and opposed to rationality, and yet, paradoxically, as a phenomenon that is legitimized or validated by that very same rationality. The Western typification of masculine and feminine genders also fits within this paradox. Next, I exemplify some manifestations of gender violence within the former historic interpretive framework, referring to paradigmatic cases. Third, I point out some critical reactions that have been raised against the practice and rationalization of gender violence since modernity. Finally, from the Husserlian phenomenological conception of the human person, whereby the conscious and rational spheres, emotional, volitive, and cognitive, are intertwined, embodied, and communalized, I attempt to reframe the problem of gender violence. I do so by appealing to a notion of humanity that equally involves every sexual identity and whose higher order rationality cannot be understood as uprooted from the deepest stratum of the life world, its instinctive, finite source. My proposal thus acknowledges in every unilateral and polarized tenet of this problem a differentiated identity or an opposed co-belonging. Only by questioning retrospectively and self-critically our subjective life in its innermost depths and discovering in our instinctive life a teleological tendency towards reason, both victims and perpetrators could recognize in themselves the ultimate source of their self-responsibility and thus a possibility of a new dawn. The perpetrators would have the possibility of accepting the irrational instinctive motivations and damage that arise from the rational legitimations of their violent actions, thereby providing for themselves the opportunity of an existential transformation, whereas the victims would have the opportunity of recognizing their constitutive capacity of reshaping their personal identities and dignity, thus enabling themselves to rise like the phoenix from the ashes of despair and disbelief. So first point, violence and reason, a paradoxical relationship. The origins. Yuval Noah Harari, in his book *Sapiens* or Sapiens, I don't know how you pronounce it, 2014, presents the history of mankind as a transition from animals to gods. The, quote, last common grandmother of humans and chimpanzees lived 6 million years ago, and human evolution started in Africa 2.5 million years ago, branching into various species in Europe, Asia, and later Oceania. Fire was extensively used 300 years ago, having been discovered 500,000 years earlier. Homo sapiens began evolving in East Africa 200,000 years ago, coexisting with other hominids, and extended its domain 70,000 years ago to regions on Earth occupied by Neanderthals in Eurasia, Homo denisova in Siberia, and the Homo floresiensis in Indonesia. And even though, according to Harari, genetic tests of some remains show that sapiens share between 1 to 6% of genetic features with Neanderthals, Denisovas, and Homo erectus, the Homo sapiens, a more developed but less tolerant and violent species, could have contributed to their extinction. The genocidal practices inherited from antiquity may have lingered in the current sapiens sapiens, and it could still be the source not only of historical war calamities, but also of current ecological catastrophes. The modern scientific revolution took place 500 years ago, and to the present day, all sorts of narratives about the unprecedented progress of humanity have been woven. Yet it is not as dramatic as it seems when seen in the light of the millions of years of the presence of hominids on the planet. The distance between the discovery of fire 800,000 years ago, its widespread use by all hominid species 300 years ago, sapiens' first cognitive revolution 70,000 years ago, and the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago. Modernity. Now, modern humanity used to claim with a dose of arrogance that its rational civilizing conquests and projected utopias could banish all instinctive barbarity and unreasonableness from mankind's past. It expected to erect reason upon arches and pillars of cathedral-like strength in order to shelter itself from natural contingency, site of the violent cycle of birth and death, passions and instincts. European theoretical certainty formulated with a clear and distinct evidences of mathematical criteria, potentiated by algebraic formalizations, was the alleged ground of both the experimental physical mathematical science inaugurated by Galileo and the modern utopian political projects. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan translated the Baconian ideal of the scientia propter potentiam to the practical political field. He depicted humanity's natural state as its desire for power and the violence of passions and appetites, whereas its natural right, jus naturale, as its will to a potentially unlimited increase of power, triggering the war of all against all and threatening the survival of the human species. Detached from its sensitive, subjective, and violent ground, only rationality, in his view, was called upon to preserve life by producing natural law, lex naturalis, and subjecting the body politic to the rational state of the rule of law. Since the 16th century, Europeans believed that these rational ideals would bring about the progress of humanity. They have inspired Western political thought from More's Utopia in 1516 to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United States General Assembly in 1948. Theoretical and practical rationality, the source of objective scientific laws and of the universal norms that rule the republic of free citizens, was deemed a privileged male province, whereas the realm of necessity, that of the contingent reproduction of the species, became the province of female, confinement, deprived from the citizens' rights of autonomy and self-determination. It was also that of a living, sensitive body of violent emotions, passions, and instincts that had to be kept under control. A hiatus between these two provinces was purported. Unconditional, absolute, and universal rationality, along with autonomy and freedom, equality and fraternity, was deemed to exclude all violent excesses and their instinctive source. Yet paradoxically, the Baconian ideal had an ominous side, rendered manifest since the French Revolution's reign of terror, of course, before, through all the rationally justified global violent conflicts that have struck humanity up to the 21st century. The extreme violence unleashed by this form of rational legitimation of the will to power is not much different from that of theocratic ideologies, such as those which in 1431 assassinated Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, at the stake on charges of heresy, or the ones that promised rewards in paradise to the young jihadist murderers of infidels. With the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, the will to power that animated leftist political projects to bring about the kingdom of freedom of a future homo absconditus have been replaced by right-wing political projects announcing a mythical brave new world that, seemingly forgetting their liberal democratic ideals and fueled by the economic interest of corporate industrial military empires, spread the idea of the unlimited and universal growth of a plentiful market. The seemingly antithetical political projects have rationally justified the use of any means to achieve their desired ends, unleashing a silent or structural violence in the globalized world, expressed in forms of subjugation, segregation, slavery, and the invisibilization of anathemized people, cultures, races, and social sectors. The 20th and the 21st centuries, very brief. The extreme forms of gender-based violence that have taken place throughout all of human history during armed conflicts have always existed, with other socially tolerated forms, invisible and or mitigated, yet denigrating ones that are nowadays increasingly rejected and denounced. Take the case of Jane Fonda, who, having been raped at 12 years old, became the darling actress of the French Nouvelle Vague and a sexual icon. She slowly evolved, increasingly engaging in political activism against the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, against climate change deniers, and exposing in her films the gender pay gap and sexual harassment. In her maturity, she understood not only that she had been the victim of a patriarchal system, but also that the men in her life that she never refused were also victims of it. Even those who, like Vadim, claimed to be non-bourgeois and without attachments. Although the feminist movement has an underground history that remained concealed since the mid-18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, until the 20th century, it was not until the 1960s that North American feminist women began to publicly expose sexual abuse and rape culture in their own homes, currently recognized as a globally reproduced cultural practice related to the widespread power still exercised by men in most societies that also target children. LGBTIQ plus communities or ethnic minorities. Historically, such empowerment is older than its rationally justified modern form, of course, and has undoubtedly originated in wars since time immemorial. Paradigmatic cases of gender violence. In what follows, I will briefly address a couple of paradigmatic cases of gender violence in Peru's recent history in order to illustrate some of its extreme forms in times of armed conflicts and some of its modalities embedded in cultural social practices. I thus first resort to some of the narrated events in the final report of the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission that refer to the period of Peru's internal armed conflict between 1980 and 1992, but it lingered until 2000. One of the international legal instruments on which the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission based its evaluation indicates that, quote, sexual rape of women constitutes a violation of fundamental and non-derogable rights of a human person, namely a form of torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading penalties or treatments. Thus, the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission determines that during the period under investigation, rape constituted a systematic practice attributable primarily to state agents, the Army, the Navy, police forces, and to a lesser extent, to members of subversive groups Shining Path Tupac Amaru movement. The international law for war cases, also used by the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also noted that sexual violence is characterized not only by the use of invasive force on the victim's body, but also by the use of coercion and or psychological intimidation for the purpose of incapacitating the victim's free consent. Rape is therefore a specific case of aggravated torture that also undermines a victim's honor and dignity as a person and subject of rights, leaving her with deep and long-lasting wounds and psychological scars. As such, it constitutes a violation of the international human rights law and a war crime used as a weapon of terror, thus a serious transgression typified as a crime against humanity by the international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions of 1949, especially following the civilian genocides in Rwanda in 1994 and the ex-Yugoslavia in 1995, triggered by political, ethnic, racial, and religious motives. Furthermore, since the Rwanda's case, in order to determine the crime, the corroboration of the victim's testimony is not required, nor is the victim's previous sexual conduct admitted as evidence, since the Rwanda's case. The Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission considered these latter elements so essential that it recommended they be introduced into the civil laws of countries in times of peace, such as Peru. Likewise, since the ex-Yugoslavia's case, violations of the international humanitarian law are not limited to the direct commission of crimes, but also apply to those who order, plan, instigate, or prepare them in any way. Several international commissions reports have also established that gang or mass rape against girls or women in advanced stages of pregnancy, leaving them injured for life if they survive, is typified as a crime against humanity. Globally, much of the advanced international legislation regarding war crimes since 1948 and 1949 has not been included in common legislations of civil societies in times of peace. Nevertheless, dramatic cases of similar crimes only seem to be growing worldwide, unless today's social media are only unveiling unspeakable truths that otherwise would have remained hidden. In Latin America, societies societies, some rape cases are rationalized as exemplary, although an increasing number of social movements equivalent to the Me Too one in the United States which in Latin America are Ni Una Menos, Las Respondonas, Las Tesis, etc., have been raising awareness worldwide. This culture will not be overcome as long as the existing social and political inertia and disinterest from the part of governments still linger. The situation worldwide is extremely severe. Only in Peru, from January to March 2020, 454 women were murdered and 1,540 cases of rape were reported in healthcare institutions. But 65% of the cases are seemingly not reported. A large number of feminicides are linked to unspeakable rapes in which age is not a factor. No, children, very small children are frequent victims. Other cases related to sexual violence include an increasing number of acid attacks on women's faces, both within families as in collective threats to women in feminist protests. In Colombia, in Chile, in Mexico, etc. International legal instruments for war cases also include forced sterilizations as crimes associated with sexual violence. This is not the case for many civil codes. In 1995, a Peruvian state birth control policy with a declared goal of reducing poverty targeted the poor and indigenous Andean or Amazonian population. This law was financed and promoted by the World Bank and the World Health Organization, concerned with third world population growth in relation to global sustainable resources. Conservatively, according to recorded data, 272,000 women and 21,000 men were sterilized here in Peru. There was some minimal degree of informed and voluntary access to the procedure at the beginning, okay? But de facto, its implementation failed. On the one hand, if the medical staff did not comply with the high quotas assigned to them, they were threatened with losing their jobs. The law soon became known as forced sterilizations, the Forced Sterilizations Act. Many women were dragged against their will or sterilized without their knowledge during a different medical procedure. The use of precarious and unhealthy surgical material in the Andes, in the Amazonian jungle, as well as a lack of post-operative care, even sometimes lack of anesthesia, okay, was reported. There were cases of procedures on women in advanced stages of pregnancy, causing death of the fetus and leaving women with severe physical and mental health problems. Several died or were later abandoned or repudiated by their husbands due to their ensuing infertility or their inability to return to work. And if this law was deemed to give access initially to an individual control over fertility, it never ceased to be controlled by the states, organizations, and international corporations, negatively affecting the most vulnerable populations that, removed from their status as subjects of rights and objectified, lacking voice and vote, became surplus and dispensable. Resilience, survival, and activism. Feminist literature already has a long and abundant historical record of women who, from the classical Greek world to the 20th century, not only contributed to the history of philosophy, science, culture, and art, but also expressed many of them almost in the secrecy of anonymity, mainly in literature, but also without much luck in public activism, the need for equal opportunities for men and women regarding education and citizens' rights. Well, the most read feminist writers, according to the internet, no, I'm not an expert in this topic, no? Are Mary Wollstonecraft in the 18th century, Simone de Beauvoir in the 20th century, and Angela Davis, Judith Butler, etc. International Women's Day, adopted officially by the United Nations in 1975, commemorates several events that occurred in the early 20th century. On March 25th, 1911, 146 textile workers, this story you must know by heart, in the United States, mostly immigrants, died in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City because the owners locked the doors to have them complete their working hours. The idea of celebrating International Women's Day was first introduced in 1910, before this event, no? At the Second International Socialist Women's Conference. But summing up both events, on March 8th, 1917, textile workers also from St. Petersburg started a strike that sparked the fall of the Russian monarchy, and that day became a national holiday in Russia, being celebrated in several communist countries. And finally, 1967, March 8th was adopted by the feminist movement for International Women's Day. So this day that these textile workers from St. Petersburg started the strike, then it was adopted by the feminist movement for International Women's Day, and the United Nations made the date official in 1977. I am interested in highlighting precisely the case of Mary Wollstonecraft. In the midst of the patriarchal age of enlightenment and the rise of pure theoretical practical reason, more remarkable than her life, described, I do not know if ironically, as an English cook and dishwasher, and yet a philosopher and writer, are the arguments in her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in 1792. Facing the prevailing conception during her time regarding the difference between men and women, grounded on the modern conception of reason as a male province and of emotional sensitivity as a female province, she argued that such difference rested rather on an access to education, guarantee of a universal social order based on reason. The literary works of other 19th century writers, such as French author Aurore Dupin, also known as George Sand, the English poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and the American writer Harriet Elizabeth Beecher Stowe, advocated not only for women's rights, but also for the demands of the working classes, the abolition of child labor in factories, and in the case of the last two, for the abolition of slavery. Nevertheless, sexism and mistreatment, gender wage differentials and abuses, which often mask more severe cases of violations, rape, etc., continued throughout the 20th century. Suffice it to present as an illustrative example what the American TV series Mad Men set in the 1950s reveals. Currently, after the early stages of the current feminist movements in the 1970s, the vindication of women has begun to modify the social relations between different sexual identities, including LGBTIQ plus members, and different vindicatory movements such as Me Too, Las Respondonas, Ni Una Menos, and Las Tesis, as I mentioned before, among others. These have been made visible through social networks and media. I'm going to skip. I'm going to skip this paragraph and maybe read this one that I had marked to skip, but I think it may be interesting because of the Peruvian case. Another vindicating experience, or healing experience of intersubjective recognition of the victims' own voices is the one offered by the Kipu Project to Peruvian women subjected to surgical sterilizations during the 1990s. As the project's authors and promoters explain, It was not a third-person narration or narrative. We did not want to tell a story about them, I'm quoting, but provide them, the sterilized women, with the tools so that the people affected by forced sterilizations could narrate their stories in their own words and demand justice and reparations on behalf of the Peruvian state. In 2013, from Chaka Studio in London, with an international team composed of members from the United Kingdom, Peru, Chile, Colombia, and Canada, and with an ethical perspective according to which the only protagonist had to be the victims, a low-cost, broad-impact interactive technology system was devised, providing disposable mobile phones to peasant victims with two options. One, to record their own story, and the other, to listen to the stories of women from geographically distant Andean and Amazonian communities. These mobile phones were the cheapest of those that are disposable. The recordings, ranging from 6 to 8 minutes long, were uploaded to a website in England, where they were translated into English and subtitled. In this way, the victims themselves, through their mobile phones, learned about the stories of other victims, of other women in other regions of Peru, totally separated, thereby creating an ever-growing intersubjective community of protagonists of their own narratives. And all of them, through the internet, were in turn heard by a global audience worldwide. The project had a design from down to up, or from downwards, or from the bottom to the top. That is, it was installed in the manner of an authentic, transcendental intersubjectivity that constituted itself as a living community, a higher order personality that demanded to be heard. The Peruvian state and the judiciary have not yet corresponded this call for justice, but women made the first step towards it, the recovery of their personal dignity through their mutual recognition as well as their global recognition. Okay, so I'm going into the fourth and last part. Embodied subjectivities and intersubjectivities, the phenomenological perspective. Western philosophers since Aristotle, but most of all since the modern ages, from Descartes to Kant, have been inclined to compartmentalize human life in several conceptual dualisms, such as mind and body, intelligible world and sensible world, theory and praxis, rational consciousness and emotional life, subjectivity and objectivity, knowledge and value, eidos and factum, male and female, in addition to subordinating the second element to the first. This inclination has been critically examined and overcome by Husserl's transcendental phenomenology since the early 20th century. The originality of his philosophical project consisted in the radical and systemic attempt to understand to what extent all these elements are correlated with each other in intentional networks that allow us to conceive a meaningful world horizon. To give an example, if today the relevance of the body is recognized in sociology as a challenge to the way we think about power, ideology, social processes, and subjectivity, as early as 1907 and 1913, Husserl was acutely aware of the mundane, vital, and subjective relative roots of the conscious and rational subject, both theoretically and practically. Thus, as an embodied, inactive, emotional, desiderative, instinctive subject, diachronically connected to the past and projected to the future across generations. Furthermore, he addressed from a totally novel perspective in the history of philosophy the problems of the embodied and rational consciousness in its correlation to the world, that of first-person lived experiences, starting from which we were supposed to examine how the surrounding world reveals itself to consciousness and how its objectivity is validated. His novel conception not only highlighted the interweaving of the human subject's conscious spheres, the cognitive, emotive, and volitive, but also established the domain of judgment and rationality, stricto sensu, as being set upon an irrational background onto which it sinks its roots and from where it emerges. Thus, not only did he abandon the concept of cognition that belongs to pure speculative reason of the Kantian tradition in order to conceive it as intertwined with other types of rational ideological functions, axiological and practical. But he also recognized that each of these intertwined rational spheres have in turn their respective backgrounds with their passive and irrational sources of sensations, feelings of attraction and repulsion, desires, cravings, longings, impulses, instincts, which ultimately arise from the depths of a passive and affective flow of undifferentiated life in the standing, flowing, living present. To sum up, Husserl was already dealing from very early on with the affective grounds of thinking, which are currently much discussed. Lastly, in his genetic stage, he stressed that between the unconscious mind and consciousness, instinct and reason, there is no hiatus, jump or discontinuity, but an ontophylogenetic or teleological, in a sort of Leibnizian way, development from instinct to reason shared by all of mankind. Likewise, he differentiated the subject's constitutive strata, the material basis of the physical body, the psychophysical stratum, the proper functions of psychic life, and finally, the emerging stratum of the personalistic spiritual world, that of the subject of rights and member of the social world. As persons, all subjects alike are not only human existences in the surrounding world, next to other things, but they are subjects for the same world by perceiving it, valuing it, and or behaving in relation to it, while being related to one another inseparably. As persons, subjects not only react as facing stimuli, but also establish relations of motivation and practical attitudes with other subjects and with things. What we have here, I'm quoting Husserl, is the active or passive ego, and indeed in the proper intrinsic sense. Undoubtedly, the natural physical differences between men, women, and LGBTIQ plus members fulfill certain differentiated functions that only partially outline the way in which genders self-constitute their own personal identities. Rather, men, women, and the members of LGBTIQ plus communities self-constitute their personal identities intersubjectively in synchronic and diachronic processes and interacting with their surrounding world. Husserl argues that the first thing constituted in the form of a community and the foundation for all other intersubjectively common things is a commonness of nature, along with that of others' organisms and his psychophysical ego as paired with my own psychophysical ego, end of quote. It is precisely upon this ground that the so-called objective world is constituted, which presupposes that the other subject sees the same thing as oneself. And, quote, this is repeated mutatis mutandis in the case of subsequently constituted mundanities of the concrete objective world as it always exists for us, namely as a world of men and culture, of mankind, humans, and culture, we could translate. Now, if each individual monadic subject is actually separated from the others, because we have different bodies and we occupy different locations in space, I cite the irreal, intentional reaching of the other into my primordiality is not irreal in the sense of being dreamt into it or being present to consciousness after the fashion of a mere fantasy. Something that exists is intentional communion with something else that exists. End of quote. Such is the effective transcendental intersubjectivity that, quote, makes transcendentally possible the being of a world of men and things. End of quote. And if this is a case, perhaps it may not be exaggerated to state, phenomenologically speaking, that there are more common transversal elements, psychophysical and spiritual, between different gender identities than there are differences that separate them. And what distinguishes an individual from another is greater than what separates men, women, LGBTIQ+, etc. In short, according to Husserl, we are intersubjectively connected in passivity and in the unconscious. We passively constitute one and the same world, one and the same objective time. We arrange our phenomenal systems intersubjectively as coordinated orders in the same time. And not only do we coexist, but our lives are mutually oriented towards each other. And we confirm them empathically with one another. The laws of Genesis are rooted in typically stable living bodies and in the possibility that nature be given to us in a stable manner. Nevertheless, personal subjects constitute their personal identities, both monadic and collective, actively, namely consciously and rationally in social acts. In this connection, we can see that the temporal community of the constitutively interrelated monads is indissoluble because it is tied up essentially with a constitution of a world and a world time. This is a quotation, Husserl's quotation from the Cartesian Meditations. Social acts of social communication render possible the constitution of social communities as personalities of a higher order, also oriented outwards from a member zero or personality, as in the case of monadic individuals. Here, I quote, I and my culture are primordial, over against every alien culture. To me and to those who share in my culture, an alien culture is accessible only by a kind of experience of someone else, a kind of empathy by which we project ourselves into the alien cultural community and its culture. What is relevant here is that this whole description has had its origin in, quote, a temporal genesis rooted in human undergoing and doing, end of quote. Such temporal genesis refers back to the historicity of every constitution. In this way, the life world and the collective identities within it are historically constituted and transformed, adopting ever new habitual properties. All of the above applies to our contemporary collective history, to the new recognition of personal identities previously excluded, exiled into the realm of the absolute alien or other, or simply rendered invisible. A recognition that emerges from the reactivation, resignification, and transformation of meaning constitutions inherited from previous generations, giving rise to new possibilities, more inclusive and fairer. Conclusion. The solution, if there is a solution, maybe this is too arrogant, to gender violence and to all violence that lashes against human beings, whether they are women, men, members of the LGBTIQ+ community, children, adults, members of different cultures, ethnicities, races, languages, religions, ideologies. requires a radical awareness of the objectifying tendency to reduce the other to a mere reified exteriority, dispensable, lacking of a sentient and conscious inner life. It therefore requires to overcome the greatest of all dangers, weariness, the smoldering fire of despair, spiritual hatred, and barbarity. But it also requires the effort to recognize in others their practical moral dimension as persons, as spiritual subjects of rights, as lives that are lived in a first-person perspective, affected by the world, and acting in it in relations of mutual understanding and communication. It is, in short, a matter of recognizing each other as subjects for the world in an inward being for one another and mutual interpenetration, and not as mere external and isolated objects in the natural conglomerate. Only in this way, as Husserl pointed out in a different but also violent historical context, will victims be able to resurface, and out of the ashes of great weariness, they will rise up as a phoenix of a new life, inwardness, and spiritualization, constitutive of new world meanings. I'm extracting quotes from Husserl's Vienna lecture, as a pledge of a great and distant future for mankind. But firstly, for the victims of gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rosemary Lerner. We have plenty of time for questions. So if people would like to either raise their hand in the chat, or I can kind of call on people to ask their sort of questions. So always have to give a second for the, Michael Barber has a question. Michael, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, for that lovely talk. That was really well done. So thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes,
okay.
Thank you.
So let me entertain a possible Kantian objection to what you're saying. And that is that really, I mean, what you were talking about, I mean, there's a kind of genetic constitution and development of who we are as human beings. And clearly to that is this idea of a free subjectivity, self-determining itself. For Kant, that becomes sort of the moral norm, I think. Kant would talk about, for instance, we are ends in ourselves because things become a means to us, but other human beings are also ends in themselves. But the difference might be that Kant has a notion of practical rationality, that he recognizes that this is the standard used in practical rationality. And one can't make a kind of slide from saying this is how we are to this is how we ought to be treated. I mean, that's sort of the naturalistic fallacy in a sense, without clarifying the fact that we are now working within a framework of practical rationality. So I guess my question would be, does Husserl distinguish that kind of practical rationality? I mean, I think I would say a Kantian would agree perfectly with what you're talking about, what the norm ought to be of how we ought to treat people. But is there kind of a, but Kant will always say, in like the Frankfurt School, will say this is practical, cognitive, not cognitive instrumental, but practical rationality, in the light of which we have this norm, and we're actually working within that framework. But I don't see that so clearly in Husserl.
Yeah, well, yeah. There are two things in Kant that Husserl not criticizes, but interprets, doesn't accept. Two things, basically. The hiatus between the world of sensibility and the intelligible world, the sensitive world and the intelligible world, that you see this hiatus, this division in Kant since his Dissertatio in 1770, okay? Since that time, Kant talks about forms and principles of the sensitive world, forms and principles of the intelligible world. And in the Dissertation, 1770. At that time, he still believed that that rationality, the intelligence and rationality, they were both working together. The judgments and inferences in the dissertatio, they were on the same standing for metaphysics. They could reach the noumenon, and they could and they also the moral perfection. So ethics, this rationality was still possible also for metaphysics, for the theoretical rationality and practical rationality. They were not separated. Okay, science in the dissertatio was limited to the sensitive world, so part of the intellectual activity had to work with the sensitive, and that was science limited to within the context of time and space, etc., etc. So he put limits to the sensitive world, to scientific world, but there was a cut, there was a discontinuity between these two worlds. They had different forms and principles. Okay, so this is the first thing that Husserl is not in agreement with Kant. Okay, Husserl is a more Leibnizian, has a more Leibnizian conception of human development. Okay, the ontophylogenetic development, which also is compatible also with many of the psychological, etc. Studies of the ontophylogenetic development of human beings. No, the emergence of consciousness from an unconscious level, the awakening of consciousness and the awakening of reason. Okay, so there's not a discontinuity. That is a first compartmentalization that Kant establishes, that Husserl does not. And then already after the dissertation, since 1772, Kant starts having problems with his account of metaphysics and the moral, etc. And it is within this period that he develops a critique of pure reason, and so speculative reason is divorced from the practical reason. No, at that moment he divorces it. Practical reason, of course, has a possibility. The highest interest of humans, reason's interest are the postulates of God, freedom, and the immortality of the soul, and also the moral values, etc. And reason, of course, there's a speculative also possibility for reason, but only as a regulatory or regulative guide to science, but not a constitutive one. So this division, this compartmentalization of reason in a practical one and a speculative one, Husserl is not in agreement with. So these are the two things that he rejects, because de facto, and in first philosophy, in his lessons for Lesungen of first philosophy in 1922-23, there are many passages where he puts examples of how when you are cognitively involved in a theoretical solution of a problem, even if you're a mathematician and you're, I don't know, solving a theorem or something like that, you evaluate you evaluate which is the best course, and you take decisions, and you have goals, and you move accordingly to your objective, and vice versa. So he puts many examples, but these examples also appear since the beginning, the first paragraphs or sections of Ideas 2, where it's a horizon, no? So mind cannot be, human lived experience cannot be separated in compartments, and less still to believe that we have an inborn, absolute, unconditional moral norm with which all human beings are born. This is not so. It would be wonderful if it were that way, but it is not so. It has to be developed, yeah? And well, but he starts with the horizon thing. So the span of consciousness is very limited, okay? This comes also from Stumpf, Karl Stumpf, and this comes from the psychology of the end of the 19th century. So we have a very, our attention span is very limited, but this attention span is surrounded by horizons that are more effective if you can just turn your gaze and actualize what was a potential or implicit. But they're also the horizon, the spatial and temporal, expand to farther dimensions that one cannot simply actualize, but they're there, not? And these horizons have to do with this intertwinement from the cognitive, the volitive, and and axiological, the evaluative. No, so for example, I don't know, I'm lying in the beach and I'm enjoying a beautiful blue sky. No, I'm enjoying the blue sky. I am, okay, when I'm enjoying the blue sky, in my attention span, I'm living in this enjoyment. But of course, I'm looking at the sky. I'm seeing the sky, but the sky is not in the forefront. What is in the forefront is this living enjoyment, no? And this happens in every case, no? And what has happened with modernity and Kant, separating these spheres or dimensions of consciousness and reason, is that there has been the idea that science, for example, research, scientific research, is axiologically neutral, no? And it is not. Nothing is axiologically neutral. And what I have not mentioned here, which would be, I would have to enter into Husserl's ethics, okay? Husserl's ethics are, of course, Husserl also has a norm, etc. But it takes into account the context in the first place. And in the second place, it takes into account the possibility that the development of the individual towards rational goals that are also practical and are also evaluative, assumes its self-responsibility. So the self-constitution of the ego has to do, it's a very central concept that maybe I should include here, because self-responsibility is probably the axe of Husserl's whole project, theoretically and practically. What he calls ultimate foundations in the epilogue of Ideas 1 ultimate foundations is self-responsibility, no? So I have to, so self-responsibility, if consciousness and rationality and the norms, etc., emerge, no? At the beginning, these urges, tendencies govern me, but in as consciousness and self-responsibility evolves, there's not a total taking into control, but yes, a need to I don't know, to self-control, take control of your own life, no, and of the life of others. So I'm sorry for the long answer, but this I would say, and in spite of that, the more I read Husserl, the more I see Kant in Husserl. I believe that Kant didn't have enough time to conciliate all the different aspects of his system. He didn't have enough time. Nobody has enough time, and maybe he would have developed in sort of in so I think it's as if Husserl had taken Kant's project and tried to overcome all of the problems that any philosopher encounters when entering in an untrodden land, no?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So our next question comes from Valerie Benz. Valerie, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Professor Lerner. I am just so much in awe of your reconstruction of Husserl and all his complexity. And I work in an interdisciplinary applied social science doctoral program. And what we have been trying to do, we've developed over several decades what we've come to call transformative phenomenology, because we've found over the course of several decades of working with over 100 PhD students studying phenomenology and applying it first person in their own lives, that they are transformed and they exhibit 10 specific qualities of being. And we also claim that Husserl saw this as an essential component of phenomenology in the crisis, where he says phenomenologies will be like a religious conversion. We found this to be true, especially the reductions in the Epoch K processes. We've worked with hundreds of students writing about their own experiences. And so I commend you for bringing this to bear. And I have wanted to let you know that we also have collected some of these in a recent book called Death Worlds to Life Worlds, Collaboration with Strangers for Personal, Social, and Ecological Transformation, including a section on the indigenous, including indigenous from the Amazon, from India, from North Dakota, direct experiences. So what we found is that we use a lot of shoots, also the life world, because standard social science concepts like society, culture, personality, they all objectify who we're studying. But Schutz and Husserl do not allow this objectification. And it's this very objectification that has led and continues to promote the kind of violence you describe, that's so horrible all over the world. We've come to call it death worlds, and we've come to capture how we deny this going on. And the death worlds are so pervasive, we have to call it out, because we are destroying our planet and we are destroying ourselves because of it. And I commend you for anchoring this so deeply in Husserl's work. And I especially commend you also for pointing out his bringing in the body. It's really hard to get academics to allow their own bodies to come into the picture. What do I want to ask you? I'm just so excited about your work because it ties in so much with what we've been working on. Oh, this is what I wanted to ask you. A colleague of mine, 4 Arrows, in working closely with Darcea Narvaez, tying neuroscience in with indigenous worldview. They contend there's 2 worldviews, the dominant, which is the kind of world that's destroying our planet and objectifies women and all the things you were characterizing. That's the dominant worldview. And the indigenous worldview before all of this happened, which saw us as integrated with all other creatures, with trees, plants, animals. And you seem to emphasize the human. However, the indigenous worldview does not put the human above the trees and the giraffes and the animals. And I feel that as long as we continue to do that, we're still going to be objectifying. And I wanted you to comment on that. Thank you. Sorry for such a long question, but I got carried away.
I missed, you were talking of someone that had done a publication on the difference of these 2 worldviews, the indigenous and the dominant. I missed the name.
Oh, yes. His name is 4 Arrows. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, please write it down.
AKA Don Jacobs. And we also include a discussion of this in the first chapter of our book, edited by me, Valerie Bentz, and Jim Marlett, called Death Worlds to Life Worlds, published by De Gruyter this year. But I'll put it in the chat.
Yes, please do. And thank you very much for calling my attention to that book, which seems extremely interesting. And I had heard from transformative phenomenology, but have not read anything specific about it. Regarding so I'm going to try to get it, and thank you so much for sharing this line of your work. Regarding the worldviews, no, precisely in the book that I published in 2014, 2015 here and in Colombia, which is called the Exilio del Sujeto, the Subject's Exile, something like that, modern and postmodern myths. I have a chapter because one of my colleagues at the university who works in, I think in English you talk about multiculturalism, but here we use also interculturalidad, interculturality, not only pluricultural, but inter, no, the interintentionality. And he gave me some text of a Brazilian who has worked with Amazonian ethnias. In Peru, we have about 62 plus different ethnicities in our Amazonian jungle with different languages, no? And this Brazilian was talking about the Amazonian indigenous worldview is multinaturalism, not a multiculturalism. No, so
that's great.
I was extremely interested in this because I wanted to see if a Husserlian worldview of interculturalism, intersubjectivity, etc., could be conciled or this multinaturalism, or if there was a cosmic antagonism between both, no? And I tackled with that. I dealt with that. I addressed that problem. Oh. And it's they call it the Amerindio, so American Indian, Amerindio multinaturalism. So I was trying to see if they were, in a Leibnizian sense, incompossible, if they could not be composed together, they could not be possible in a unity, if they were incompossible cosmovisions or worldviews or not. And what I worked out what I thought was maybe a solution. It's the mythical perspective and the transcendental perspective is a search for origins. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, of course, there's a long development in chapter 10 of this problem. But of course, we do not want to fall again, go back to a naive return to the Bon Sauvage of Rousseau, no? We can't turn back history. We can't. Of course, all of our sedimented experiences as mankind, global mankind, because we're now all interconnected, all. So, and these histories are starting to intertwine, and they all are enmeshed in a route that goes forward. It doesn't go backwards. So I believe that these, of course, the dominant worldview, the globalization, stems from the Western rationalization, the Western, what I've talked about in a very cursory way, of mathematical rationality and the mathematization of nature, et cetera, and all of that comes. But we're reworking that. So I think that the paths that Husserl gives us are those of, for example, the origin of geometry. No, the sedimented meanings that are already that have already constituted our cultural identities all over the world. We retrieve them. No, they pass across the generations. We retrieve them. We receive them with our language, from our parents, from our schools, our neighbors, our neighborhood, our nationalities. So and we retrieve and we transform. We take a distance and also transform. And this is also the Gadamerian, how do you call it? The distance, the effectual distance or something like that. So
fusion of horizons.
Huh?
He says fusion of horizons, Gadamer.
Fusion of horizons is what we find in the concept also of reason in Husserl, no? And Gadamer takes it up, etc. But no, it's a distance. As the farther we are from a past event, taking a distance from a past event, we can understand its meaning better, and we can distance ourselves from it or transform it and reconstitute, resignify. So the indigenous and the dominant worldviews, of course, they are opposed, but they're also enmeshed in our current world, and we really can't go back, no? Time pushes us forward all the time, no? So this is what I would say, no?
Yes, thank you. Hoping to go forward with that.
4 arrows, okay.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Bruce Novak. So Bruce, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I hope I'm unmuted. I somehow got into safe driving mode. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. I'm sorry I can't get a picture. I'd like to try to connect the first, and thank you for this very, very moving and also deeply intellectual talk. I'd like to start with a very practical question, which is that you mentioned near the outset of your talk the suffering of the perpetrators and how phenomenology can get us to recognize that suffering. And my question is, and then I'll frame it a little bit, is there a way that phenomenology can educate the perpetrators of violence? How does one get into the mindset of the perpetrators of violence? And I don't know that Husserl has an educative policy, but I do know that, going back to the first question, that Kant, being a Rousseauian and being an Emilian Rousseauian, not a second discourse Rousseauian, is centered upon education and believes that, and that there, you mentioned the split in Kant, but the peak of Kant is the third critique, where he tries to connect the epistemology and morals, and does that through an education through beauty and sublimity. Now, it strikes me that for Husserl, when he talks about empathy, that is perhaps the critical and central form of sublimity. That is, the mind recognizes that it is touched and can grow and can change. And in sometimes it can convert itself from living in a death world that Valerie referred to living in a life world. But I'd like to get more of a concrete picture from you, if you can offer it. I realize this is a difficult question. Of is there a way that we can phenomenologically educate the perpetrators of violence who are isolated in a dominant culture?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because it also addresses medical questions, psychological questions, psychiatric questions, suffering of perpetrators. There are perpetrators, many perpetrators are psychopaths, sociopaths. They are irredeemable, okay? We know that. I mean, but they're always, I mean, if you have a human being before you, you can never throw your towel. Now, of course. So
well, I didn't understand the last phrase you said. You can never
throw the towel.
Okay, throwing the towel.
Throwing the towel, is that a normal expression for you?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, but I'm going to mention one case, South Africa Truth Commission. The South African Truth Commission with Desmond Tutu, etc. They called the perpetrators, and they had this special thing that we didn't have here, no, which was because over there it was the forces, it was the apartheid, it was the white that did the violence to the Black and brown communities, but they pardoned them if they faced their victims and they heard the victims and they talked to the victims and they confessed their crimes. it was a cathartic experience, extremely, extremely terrible in South Africa. We have learned about that because when we were doing our own, we had also these, how do you call it, these meetings where the victims told their stories. But here we didn't have the perpetrators. But over there, and then I heard some perpetrators being interviewed in BBC in London. There was a program called Heart Talks, and they impacted me terribly, because the perpetrators, when they see the victims, etc., many of them change, because they have been working within a context, a cultural context, in which the other is just an object, not a person, not a subject. So these you don't call them meetings. I can't remember the name right now, but there were these hearings, no, with the perpetrator. So in that case, in those cases where perpetrators are perpetrators because they have started by objectifying the victim, the other, etc. It's not a person. It's not a subject. Has no inner life, no suffering. Huh? So that's why I took that, because I think that's something that we have to take into account. It also has to do with culture. And cultures tend to, or groups, no, social groups tend to group among each other, and the others are the alien, the other, yeah, the alien, the enemies, totally, we have to rebut them, etc. Regarding the critique of judgment, you're right. And not only, you were talking about the critique of judgment. That's why I said that in Kant, the development of Kant's thought was going in a direction where he was trying to consolidate, and also the anthropology in a pragmatic sense, which comes at the end of Kant's life. And about the empathy in Husserl, empathy is not sympathy. Empathy alone is only a modalization, a modification of perception. It's a perception of the others, of the other as a subject. That's all. You have to have sympathy. You have to have emotional. You have to have feelings. You have to have emotional acts, emotional intentional acts, which have the value component in order to have sympathy, but this all comes together. But in Husserl, I'm not talking about Scheller, which I hardly know any Scheller. I should, but I hardly do not. I hardly know anything of Scheller. But empathy is only the perception. So the basis of empathy is the perception of the gests and the behavior of another, the perception of his body and of his movements, and it has all of these passive elements and processes of association and pairing, etc., which are not conscious, whereby empathy occurs, and so we perceive the other as having an inner self, that is a subjective life, which is the thing, not to objectify the other. No?
Yeah, and your example of the commission is a beautiful application of that. So thank you for that beautiful answer.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, we're at time. There's so much more I think we could talk and go on here. I want to thank Dr. Rosemary Rizo Patron de Lerner for her wonderful kind of keynote presentation here, and great conversation and wonderful talk. And I thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for being here as well. So hope to see everyone tomorrow and Saturday at some of the next sessions. So have a wonderful day or evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.